Привет, как обещал, пытаюсь записать видос о презентации, о том, что я буду рассказывать. Так, опа, понеслась. То есть я не успел подготовить хорошо видео, которые будут в слайдах, поэтому, возможно, получится чуть дольше. Где-то будут баги, где-то косяки в видосах, ну и хрен с ним, я их потом повырезаю в последний момент. So, let's start. Today I will talking about naked truths of validation because I spend a lot of time doing it natively, and let's talk about a bit later. So my name is Igor, and I spent about 7 years develop front end mostly, and lots of stuff on server side. Intelligence, big data, blockchain, and so on, but mostly at the front end. And a bit crazy because I start teaching children, but my children is about 27 years old, and they know lots of Java or backend stuff, and never play with the front end, and they trap in trouble because I try to explain them the patient they have to promote to the front end and how it's important, how to use it correctly, and how to save time reducing lots of bullshit from the internet using in your project. For example, if we start talking about validation with that guys, it's pretty hard to explain them how to use it because you can say, okay, we have, you don't should care about validation because there is lots of stuff and modes on the npm. You can just load it and play. For example, validation, and you find that people can't understand how connect that to the code they have. For example, HTML, CSS. You may say, okay, they may use React, for example, and nothing become simple because now they need to know about React a lot, try to understand why decorator is inside the HTML, not so easy. Why should we have to use decorator at all in the validation proposals? It's not so easy to explain for people who never do it. So, also, I found that they don't care about forums at all, because forums it's not so fun, not so cool stuff. There is not so many animations. Designers not willing to spend a lot of time prepare beautifully forums with good design inputs and workflows. So many customers from the public resources like, for example, shops, magazines, and so on, you lose lots of customers because they trap in the troubles in these forms, not understand what you want from them to feel. For example, at the BMW site, you can spend a lot of times to try to feel something because they not polite with exceptions, and you're not sure what they want from you. Similar, for example, the Twitter, maybe you know. Okay, my name not so hard. Okay, my name is John Cena, and 1 second. Okay, now it's better. And I try to feel, for example, for phone it's not correct, but I not expect. Okay, next. Sign up. What is it? Uh, uh, why I don't see the field, for example, for the SMS? Why the M don't? I try to, for example, try to move forward somehow. Not clear what's going on. Oh, wow, cool. Email field. Nice. It's current Twitter form for registration and not so easy as for me. Again, password. Okay, cool. So, move ahead. Many sites have troubles with forms. For example, with not clear exceptions, for example, at the street field, you need a street and street exception. Cool, cool. Uh, or for example, when you see this kind of exceptions, like you not pass these rules, or how many rules you need to pass to move forward, and they should be runtime when you're feeling, not when you blur somewhere, because when you change focus, it doesn't mean everything goes right. Maybe it's a dialogue. Maybe it's something you need to pick from the, for example, your PC like file. You lose the focus because focus is the operation system feature, not the browser one. So what's the goal? The goal is to reduce user input exceptions as much as possible and make it easier. Also, we can simplify it because by reducing numbers of fields, but as you see, for example, Twitter becomes in trouble because it's not so easy when you reduce some inputs but hiding them somewhere next form, for example, next step, and not so cool. It's not the reducing right way. And most of all, we need to increase KPI. We want our users to spend more time, spend more monies on our products, and feel much more comfortable, mostly, but not often. And I want to provide you a solution. As you know, developers is more important in this case because developers do it, and they should do it much easier way without any troubles, headaches, and I don't want to spend more time on the forums truly. So we may believe that server-side validation is good, but yes, it should be good. But when user receive server-side exceptions, it mean you not promote them, not teach them how to avoid that. You are not good friend as front-end developer. So our tools is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and using that we have to help user to avoid the exception on server side as much as possible. So I found the good tutorial from the Pavel, I suppose, about constraint validation. I suppose it's a good one, and I picked something from that, but mostly not. For example, constraint validation API is seems have a good support, except all the EE browser. I suppose we shouldn't care about them because they have a few less percentage of user right now. So, for example, HTML, what we can do is validation. We have kind of types of inputs, for example, email, URL, phone number, and so on and so on. And they maybe can help us to avoid exceptions. For example, a user can't input email in our fields, or for example, can't fill the letters in number field, but it mostly doesn't help us a lot. But also we have some attributes, for example, min, max, and step for numbers. We can, for example, provide a range user can input, and step to, for example, somehow prevent small numbers. Also, we have min, max length for text fields. It's cool, but mostly not, because it's easier to understand what can be min, but not easier for us mostly to understand what is max, because names could be huge. You don't know how two people can be named. Most used one is the potent, because we can provide a regular regexp there and validate everything we wish using strings match pattern. Also, we have required field. It's most used as for me because it helps us understand that user feels something or not or miss. Uh, shit happens sometimes. So also we have title attribute. It helps us, to, for example, to customize the exceptions by using default attributes. So let's move ahead and see how it looks like. For example, I also promote you to use field sets because field set is cool because it provides us control over the disabled everything inside it. Because, for example, we can have a button, and also you see it disabled when field set is disabled. Much easier disable it everything using one way of truth than disabled everyone by the attribute. Also, I don't recommend you use the input type submit because it looks ugly and you have to, for example, fill the value to set up, for example, title. And button seems much more customized and much more simpler to type. And also button have type attribute, and you see it can be submit also, and you don't care about input type submit because you have button type submit. I suppose it's much cooler because when you read, for example, HTML, you realized what is going on. Also, I don't recommend you use IDs, for example, for labels. I mostly recommend you, for example, have wrap everything. Everything depends to input inside the label because it seems much more easier because when you, for example, miss titles and misclick to, for example, exceptions, you have to focus to the input itself. Not, I don't wish. I don't. I hope user shouldn't copy paste exceptions, and and you see the code become much more simpler. We don't have any extra IDs we shouldn't care about. Also, we can, for example, have one way of truth. For example, input at the beginning. It describes what is going on, bottom of it, and it also easier to customize input fields with anything we need, everything. So let's make everything styled. For example, we can name a label like form item. Item. Yeah. And also it should be have a it should have a label. So let's name the span like a label. It's cool. And also it have, for example, okay, something when something correct field, and we have exception message if something wrong. I suppose it's quite simple pattern to remember it and easy to use. Let's try to customize it. We have an item, form item. We first of all we can use most popular, I suppose, display a field like a field flex, because flex is much more. Using flex, it's quite easier to customize everything. For example, we may use columns to reorder something, and also we have order field to reorder like we wish. Like, for example, label should be first, input should be second one, exceptions or a success message can be later. And for example, one day when designer wants to switch something, for example, reorder something or display inline, you can easier to do it without any headaches and without changing the HTML. And as you see, everything works right with the focus inside the input. So I suppose it's a good pattern and can be easier to reuse it everywhere for everyone controls. Also, as you know, there is a tilde operator that provides us, for example, possibility to select everything same level next to, for example, to the input. And it's cool because you see we have a good order. We have a good way of choose, for example, to customize it somehow. For example, exceptions red, success green, and that's it. Let's move ahead. What we can do using CSS for validation proposals. We have also required an optional placeholder valid and invalid prefix selectors. I don't know how to pronounce it. So we can use it like the attributes inside forms. We know everything about validation, for example, valid and invalid inside the CSS. And it's cool, it provides us lots of possibility to do. Also, it would be cool if we have, for example, user error attribute in CSS that may allow us to understand that exceptions, or for example, input become invalid because user feels something, but not because we just display the form. It can be exceptions. And also, it would be cool if, for example, it become valid or invalid by user. But user invalid is not so cool sounds. Also we have placeholder, and we can detect that it's shown or not by CSS. It's cool. Let's move ahead and see the demo. For example, I just spend more time and customize everything and make much more beautiful same way. Let's see how it looks like. We have a form inside the field set, like was before. Also, we have a label and response inside the, for example, input. Also, we have two buttons, cancel and submit, to play with forms. It also have, for example, input with valid to provide the space to success bubble. As you see, there is no validation right now, but focus works well. But as you see, focus not so cool. Let's make it much more beautiful by using reducing outline and provide transition, box shadow, and box shadow itself. Let's look like it's look. Looks much more beautiful with animations that you can do by outlining. So, what about validation? How to detect that field is invalid? Also, we need, for example, red dot to recognize required fields. Now, let's create extra styles for that. Because we have a label, we can easier to add it by using before-after attributes. Before dot, make it red, color red, done. Yeah, dot is done, but mostly we need after we have to have such a kind of text. It also can be easier to done without need to type it everywhere and care about. So, what about hide the dot when we doesn't need it? By, for example, our guides. Some for needed or someone not. We can use no dot, for example, attributes and hide everything by using labels and done. No dot anymore. Okay, it looks a bit nicer. So continue to customize validation by CSS. We want to fill something and expect that input display right colors and by using our regex for validation. For example, let's create more styles. So on input, we should to detect valid and invalid attribute by CSS, and for example, change border color to red, for example, or green if it valid. Woohoo! And for red for invalid. Success is red, green, cool. Invalid is fuck. That's gonna invalid. Cool. Yay! It's alive. But we also have to customize, for example, error message and success message somehow. Let's try it. For example, first of all, we may hide it by default. Display none. Secondary, we need to trigger it somehow by using input validation. For example, let's try to display it just to check everything works. Display block. Display block. Cool. And also is the same, for example, for the valid control. Let's check, and nothing. We see nothing. Okay, valid. Yay, valid, but display flex. Hey, now it's better. And similar to your exceptions, and oh, we see it. So let's try and make it more dynamic by valid and invalid attributes. Let's see them both on invalid. Cool. Nice. And we may add more colors and stuffs to receive right feeling. Oh, invalid. Sorry. And that's it. Seems it working. Yay! But what's wrong? It's valid by default, but we don't want to see something valid while user feel nothing, because it feels wrong. And sometimes we need to, for example, make labels red else, similar to exceptions. You see, it's easier to do when you have a right markup, but when you have a bit different one, not so easy. You decide, okay, it's possible only with JavaScript. As you see, we can provide some default value, and the default value provide the validation works also for default ones. Also, there is one tricky issue you may trap with playing with defaults. For example, we may use max length, for example, 4, and default value in min length, for example, 2, 1. Okay, and we may have a default value much larger than validation is. Yay! You see, we invalid. I can type more or remove something because I have min in max length. I can type nothing. Yay! Because that's why I try to avoid it. Use pattern to validate somehow without any other defaults attributes as much as possible. So let's move ahead and try to play with placeholder. For example, when we see placeholder, it means user feel nothing. And so let's mark the field valid only when placeholder is hide and user feels something mean. And for invalid the same. The input shouldn't be invalid by default. It should be invalid only if user feels something. Something goes wrong. Ah, fuck. Yay! Now it's better. I try to feel something. Hi, exceptions, yay! And valid, yay! Everything runtime, no JavaScript, not so hard understandable CSS, and everything is done and looks beautiful. Let's move deeper. For example, what if we start, for example, whatever if we try to make, for example, button disabled, sometimes it needed when sometimes it needs to disable button when user feels something wrong to prevent them to click submit button at all. For example, the button is enabled by default. You feel something, it becomes disabled, means something is wrong. You can't do nothing, and exceptions should be shown. In our case, we can provide, for example, disabled markup for button. Like disable color, disable background, and also it can be, for example, disabled color. And color, it's done. And that's it. The button becomes disabled by default. Let's make it much more dynamic, because form also have a valid and invalid field, and we may use attributes from the form itself, not from the input one, and make it more beautiful. For example, when the when the form is invalid, let's make the button disabled. Button shouldn't be disabled, just button. Hey, we feel something wrong, button is disabled, looks much more better and much easier to work with. So let's disable only one button, not every button on our page, and done. We can move further and, for example, customize every one field we have in HTML somehow and see how they work with our CSS we already done. For example, we have checkboxes. I customize every customized CSS. I move far from our code we shouldn't care about. Let's play only with validation. The markup for every control is the same. For example, label, similar to the checkbox label, input, span, so on. Extra, we have a placeholder here. It needs to render dots and square rectangles. So similar to range, similar to, for example, selector. So as you understand, every control can have similar markup and follows the similar rules, and it provides us possibility to customize everything using the same way without any extra butthead inside our head. So let's go ahead and, for example, I group the controls by the invalid behavior by default. For example, we may define the controls can't be handled by CSS only, know-how, because as you see, they become red by default, and we can't handle it somehow. And selects fields not work with validation at all, because CSS for selects it's not possible to define is select valid or invalid, because it have value by default every time. And also we have controls that can't be invalid at all. For example, range. Range can't be invalid no matter what we fill inside. For example, we have min 4, but the value is less, and it valid because the value by default becomes 4 no matter what we fill. Similar to the color. Color can be invalid, but we, for example, have required attribute because we not sure about, and we don't know about that behavior. And let's remove it by using CSS. So we shouldn't care about required, because the input are filled by default. Other fields, as you see, for example, search, phone, URL, date time, works well. But let's try to make somehow selects works by CSS. For example, because we have required attribute on it, we may use required field, but as you see, we can't customize it somehow. We can't reset by default or make it valid. It's not possible. Similar, I tried to play with range picker and make it play somehow before I defined that it's not possible to be validated. For example, required on range by default is true, because it filled with value by default. It's not possible to make range without any filled by default. So not worked. Hey, so why we need JavaScript? Because by default, that example we see, because we need to override, for example, native error exceptions markup, not possible by CSS only. We have element set custom validity property to, for example, add our custom logic to validation and notice user about. We have also report validity, but not recommend to use it at all. Set custom validity by default with empty strings become valid for input. Also, we have no validate attribute for forms itself. It disabled native behavior of form for validation. So, also we should care about focuses by ourselves, because if we disable validation behavior, inputs lose the focus possibility by default when you submit. For invalid fields, you should manage focus by yourselves. Let's move ahead and play. So let's focus on only forms that not works well, and I prepare some JavaScript for that. For example, sublinks. It relatives same level. Also, I have a set input focus method to set somehow focus. For example, for this one fields, I need a bit different behavior, and also I need some different behavior for some custom fields. By default, I just pick first input and set focus on it. Yeah, you see, it doesn't work. But that is default behavior for the browser. Show somehow unbeautiful notice exceptions. So let's prepare something for override it. Let's say set input error message. We have the label for yours, and also we have a validity message from input itself, the text you see, and we can just input it in the error box we have. Also, we have input validity method and set, and we can use that set error exceptions like that. For example, we find next subling. Next subling, if contain class error, it means the right error message. Then we try to override text inside it by using a validation message. Also, we set attribute valid or invalid by our own to help inputs doesn't support placeholders play somehow with validation. I mean this one of fields. Also, we should care about select, because select have no behavior by default using CSS only way. And we may just on change check validity as I described before, and let's see how it works. Turn on, reload the page, change something. Hey, become green! Yay! Select nothing, and we see exceptions generated with generated message from the browser. It's cool. Also, let's try to override form behavior to avoid this kind of message. First of all, we need somehow prepare some, for example, long tasks like a request to the server side. Also, you need to create some hooks for every form we have. As you remember, we have about 3 forms, and try to override it. Every form have field set inside. Every form may have input and select inside. On submit, we try to, for example, check validity, and also we should care about no validate attribute on the forms. On submit, we can use check validity method we created before. It returns true if invalid, and false if everything is okay. And if we try to find, we find first one input is wrong. Anyway, try to focus it somehow. Also, we use field set like loading and set disabled attribute on and off by the process done. Let's try it runtime. Reload the page. Try to submit something. You see focus set on the checkbox. It's cool. Let's try this one. Yay, we have focus. We have not filled field exceptions. Much more beautiful. Try to fill the forms right way. 1 second. Email. Name. Okay, I have pattern validation here for the email. Same way. 1 second. And it's done. Okay, message. Cool. Submit. Yay! Everything works cool. We have validation by the JavaScript, but it's not yet done because we need somehow turn off fields we don't touch by user. For example, using this kind of method, we may detect inputs works wrong. The list is not so much because let's make it beautiful. Uh, 1 second. Oh, for example, checkbox, radio, week, months, date, time, and file. The only ones looks wrong by default. So let's make them untouched. Oh, oh. For example, we set for everyone attribute untouched by default, and after blue, you change the focus, for example. We remove this kind of attributes and make it touched. Let's try. Everything looks good. Try to focus someone. Yay, checkbox. We set focus. It's wrong. Looks much. We have small bugs, but it doesn't matter right now. Celix still works. Let's try file pickup. You see, we have wrong message for the files because we need extra stuff for that case. Let's render beautiful message for everyone input, no matter how it looks like. Let's pick every input, but not daytime, date, month, week, because these fields look weird, and you can't input on it runtime. You should to change focus somehow to make it invalid, for example. They works quite different way than native inputs, other inputs works, because I call it weird, strange input. So let's make, for example, all inputs trigger on input when you time input something, but not that inputs. For strange one, we will use blur event to trigger exceptions. And just use input on it. Set error message runtime by default. So let's try, for example, something. Search. You see, we receive beautiful exceptions runtime, similar like CSS, but with correct one messages. And when you play with strange inputs on blur, we receive exceptions. Similar, quite good. Everything works good with focus. Cool. Also, when something we missed, we'll work with submit. So we cover almost every case is possible to do with the forms, but not all. Let's talk about, for example, file picker in case of custom validation rules. Because, for example, for files, we can define quite strange behavior. We pick, for example, image, yes, and try to submit it. Nothing wrong. But what if, for example, we want to handle small files and reduce, for example, the number of kilobytes we want to upload? like that. For example, we can create custom message validator and use, for example, onChange to receive files and set custom validity by using some kind of rules. For example, if file have a huge size, we may have set a custom validity to the, for example, with exception. Da-da-da. And when everything is good, we can set empty string. It's not so cool, but for example, it's quite good for demonstrate. And when now we receive the file larger than 2000 kilobytes, we may trigger exceptions. For example, for small files, it should be works good. But to simplify it, let's change the rule because we can. And now it will trigger exception only on small files like this, but for large it should be good. Yay! It's good for large files. So what we can do with it? We may create, for example, custom rules behavior to avoid using custom functions everywhere, because we try to be much more native. For example, custom rules. What is it? It's custom attribute called as you wish that provide, for example, a handler for input in files. So same behavior like we have before, and also we trigger change message input. So how it works? We receive an object with custom rules. We receive all attributes input have, and we iterate by the attributes, check the rules, and set the exceptions if something have, and done. It looks quite simpler to use it everywhere. Let's move in the code below, for example, that we use before for custom validity check. And check validity, set message, play with attributes, and that's it. You see, we have just attribute with custom message inside. So it validates somehow and says that message if something goes wrong. Let's try. And it's green. Why it's green? It should be red. Still green. Sorry. Seems something goes wrong there. Not so easy. Still not so easy. What is wrong? For example, maybe something here. Let's try hide it. Sometimes shit happens. As you see, as I understand, that exceptions goes because let's try. We need to submit it, because when we submit something, we receive exception, and because we trigger our custom validation rules only on submit, not on check, and that's why. Let's override our change handler we used before, and for example, set our custom. Let's check validity right here by input, and that's it. Let's try. Small image looks good. Submit good. Let's try with smaller one. Yay, so small. Looks good. Let's move ahead and summarize everything. We can validate almost everything using native method without needs any huge custom libraries, without any headaches. But we need to set up a bit of JavaScript and a bit of CSS once. It's much easier to do when you have right markup, and the result is about 4 kilobytes in just zip for all index.html we have with controls and everything. I suppose JavaScript would be quite small, but it just zip, not gzip, because I don't know how to make it on Mac simple way. So this way is easy customized, easy support when you need to change something. For example, make it more, for example, accessibility, provide more, create it much more, for example, beautiful with animations and so on. It's easier to do, and it have no dependencies at all, so it can be easier to reuse everywhere, and it's possible to load everything progressively, because as you see, we group every input by groups. For example, some inputs not supports validation without JavaScript, but mostly supports. So we can reorder them, and first loads every input supports validation by CSS, and allow user, for example, start interactive behavior with it, and later loads everything depends on data, or for example on JavaScript a bit later, and we don't stop user to fill something. And the end all demo is available by using this QR link. Hope you have a good time with me. So that's it.